without any further delay, turn it over to Xander, and thank you for being here.
Great. Okay. Well, thank you for the introduction, and thanks to everyone at PTU for the time to kind of bring you up to speed on this campaign. Basically, our goal is to bring legal protections to Pasadena Municipal Code, to the local law, which would protect tenants from unjust evictions and also try to control the rates at which rents rise in the city. And I'm going to talk this talk. I'll try to keep it short so there can be discussion and question and answer at the end. But it's divided into roughly three parts. At the beginning, I'll tell you things you probably already know about how bad. Really take a look at the numbers and see how bad the situation with rent burden on tenants is in Pasadena. Then we're going to talk about sort of an overview of these two prongs to this law we're proposing: the eviction protection half and the rent control half. And then the last part will be explaining what the next steps are and how Pasadena Tenants Union can. I mean, it's already involved, certainly, and has been in drafting this amendment. But how people can really get involved en masse with getting the word out and actually hitting the streets and gathering signatures. So, let's see if good. First of all, before I present any statistics, I have to give credit to Jane, who really did an incredible job extracting information over the last decade or so about the financial conditions of rental housing and tenants who live in it in Pasadena over about the last decade. And she worked with these surveys, these annual surveys from the Census Bureau, to really paint a clear but depressing picture of the situation in Pasadena. And so pretty much all of the graphics in here and the numbers in here were just shamelessly stolen from Jane. So thank you, Jane. But I'll start with just kind of an overview of rental housing and rent burden in Pasadena. So one thing I didn't know until recently, actually, or until I started looking at this data, is that Pasadena is actually a tenant majority city. Most Pasadenans rent. And of those people renting, over half spend more than 30% of their total household income on rent. And this puts them into a category of rent-burdened tenants, which means that they're really beginning to struggle to make rent each month. And also, it becomes very hard for people in this category who are spending this much to save really any money at all, whether that be for retirement or for emergencies like medical emergencies or job loss. So it really, being in the rent burden category, causes long-term damages to families financially and puts a lot of stress on them. But the situation is even worse than that, because 27% of Pasadena renters spend over half of their income on rent. And this puts them in the category of severe rent burden. And just to get an idea of how serious this is, so our city, which, the city council, I think any of us who have interacted with them know that they're quite hostile to really strong rent protections, and especially to rent control. I mean, it's been really just kind of openly derided by the mayor and others. And so it should say something that the city has actually officially acknowledged that severe rent burden, spending more than half of your income on rent, is the single greatest predictor of homelessness risk. So when we look at these numbers, we have to keep in mind that over a quarter of Pasadena renters are in this category where they are really imminently at risk of losing their homes. Of course, as with all of these sort of economic crises, which we'll see, it's really a crisis of greed and extraction. The burden falls most heavily on working people, on people who don't have enormous incomes. And we find that among Pasadenans with total household incomes between $10,000 and $50,000 a year, 60% spend over half of income on rent. So 60% are really in danger of losing their homes. And this is crazy. Obviously, it's really, really, really bad. But there's this question, I think, which is, how do we get here? We have this enormous homelessness crisis and this housing affordability crisis. And how do we get to be in this situation? And so another of Jane's really great graphics that she put together is this plot of the median rent. So it's median gross rent. That's the actual rent plus utilities in Pasadena from 2012 to 2018. And you can see that it's growing from a little under $1,300 a month to about $1,700 a month. But actually, the important thing is the comparison between the red line on top and the black line on bottom. So if you don't know, there is an index called the Consumer Price Index, and it tracks roughly the cost of living in a particular place, and importantly, how much that cost of living increases each year. And it is an average, a weighted average, of things like the price of a dozen eggs, or a gallon of gasoline, or a ticket on public transportation, or education expenses, you name it. It's all bundled together to give a picture of how quickly a place is getting more expensive to live in. So this black line is a projection Jane made using this initial amount, $1,300, and moving forward saying, what if rent had only gotten more expensive at the same rate that the average cost of living gets more expensive? And it actually would only have increased to about $1,450, right? So you have this $150 jump in the median rent. But of course, over that time, the actual cost of rent wildly outpaced that. And so, you don't have this situation where, LA is just an expensive place to live, or Pasadena is just an expensive place to live. You have, willful exploitation of tenants by landlords who know that they can extract, more out of people than they should be in any ethical sense, because, it's very hard to find a new place to live. And so this process of this greed, this unchecked greed, pushing rental housing prices up out of proportion with other costs of living, has gone on for even more than a decade. This is just really the most of the last decade. And so the reason we are where we are now with rent burdens, with this homelessness crisis, is just because the government has done nothing at pretty much any level, except there's some motion recently, but I'll argue that it's not sufficient and we need to take action. Has done nothing to check this and to guarantee that people don't get priced out of their homes. So one last point, I'll talk about our actual proposal, but I do want to make this point, yet another graphic stolen from Jane, about when we discuss this so far, it sounds like it's an economic issue, like it's one of these sort of broad issues of some market behaving badly, and it sounds very technical and impersonal. But I think it's important to remember that not only is there a disparity in this rent burden for people with different incomes, so that working people are hit the hardest, but there's also a racial disparity, and a pretty clear one. So 70% of Black households in Pasadena rent, and about 68% of Latino or Latina households in Pasadena rent as well. And so it stands to reason that they're going to bear, really the brunt of this rent burden. And you can see this very clearly in this graphic. So on the outside in these boxes are, by zip code, the fraction of the people living in the zip code who are rent burdened, who are forced to pay more than 30% of their household income on rent each month. And on the inside, you have the fraction of Pasadena's Black population that lives in each zip code. And looking at the top here in zip codes like this, the zip code in purple, and comparing that to 91108, this area around San Marino, there's over a 20% disparity in the rent burden, and almost a 30% disparity in the fraction of the Black population living here. So it's just important to remember, I think, to me, that this is not just an economic crisis, but it is actually it is a racist and classist injustice, that we need to keep in mind those histories when trying to understand exactly the magnitude of the impact that this housing crisis has on Pasadena as a community. So those are the depressing slides. I'm done with them, and now I'm going to talk about what we've proposed and try to overview this language for this proposed law that we've been writing for some time now. And as I mentioned, it has two prongs. So the first half of this law deals with just cause eviction protections. And what that means is that landlords are prevented by law from evicting tenants without any good reason. And good reason translates to just cause in the legalese. And so the just causes are listed in the proposed language. And it's actually a relatively short list. There are about 10 of them, and a lot of them are technical. They have to do with government orders. So there really aren't very many that we would expect to see very frequently. So landlords, lose a lot. They can't just arbitrarily evict people without a good reason. So just some examples. Landlords could still evict tenants for failing to pay rent. Failure to pay rent is a just cause. And I know that this is very problematic, especially now, when people are losing their incomes through no fault of their own because of the coronavirus crisis. But the trouble is that if we don't put in failure to pay rent as a just cause, we will immediately get sued and the law will be eviscerated. So this has to be in there. Another example, landlords could evict tenants for violating the lease agreement in substantial ways. So if you destroy all your appliances and rip out the drywall and start raising livestock in your apartment, they can evict you for that. On the flip side, landlords could not evict tenants because, for example, they want to bring in wealthier tenants at a higher rent. So they can't just flip their apartments because they believe they can double their monthly income. And they also can't harass or retaliate against tenants using threats of eviction or actual eviction filings. For example, because maybe their tenants join a tenants union and start organizing against their interests. Well, they can't evict them to try to prevent this unionization. So it's an important and strong protection to kind of enumerate the just causes and enforce them. But I mentioned this failure to pay rent being a just cause, and if you think about it for a while, you realize that there's a pretty big loophole in these protections. Say I'm an unscrupulous landlord and I have tenants I want to get rid of. Maybe they join the tenants union and I want to get rid of them. And I know that I can't evict them for that cause. What I'll do is I will triple or quadruple or quintuple the rent. And then next month, when these tenants predictably can't pay $5,000, I will kick them out. And on paper, I will have evicted them because they failed to pay rent. So it's clear that we can't protect people from arbitrary evictions unless we also regulate the amounts by which landlords can increase rents. So this brings us to this second half. There we go. So the second half of our proposed law, which is the rent control. So rent control, as I mentioned, limits the amounts landlords can increase rents by for ongoing tenancies. So a lot of people, when they hear rent control, they think of a law in which the city somehow sets a global maximum for the amount that can be charged for apartments in the city, and that's actually not how the law works. There is a state law called it was this Costa-Hawkins bill passed in the 90s that doesn't allow any municipality, including Pasadena, to restrict the rent that a landlord charges for new tenants. So if old tenants leave, new tenants come in. Unfortunately, the landlord is totally free to ask whatever initial rent they want. But what we can and plan to do is to limit the rate at which the landlord can increase that rent once they've made that initial deal with the tenant. And so our law would cap that increase about 2 to 3%, hopefully closer to 2% annually. And the first thing that this does is it prevents that kind of eviction loophole that I mentioned earlier. They can't just double the rent, right? So you actually have strong eviction protections coupled with this rent control. But the second thing it does actually is best understood by understanding why we chose this number, 2 to 3%. The number is actually determined by 75% of the overall increase in cost of living around Pasadena. And the hope is that we've seen these recent increases in minimum wage, which are encouraging. They don't account for the fact that minimum wage has either been stagnant or just barely kept up with this overall average cost of living, the CPI, since 2000. But the hope is that moving forward, if wages at the very least, minimum wages at the very least continue to grow with CPI, with this average cost of living, that by choosing a rent cap lower than the average cost of living, then in the long term, 1 decade, 2 decades, 3 decades down the road, for the bulk of families in Pasadena, not only are they not getting more rent burden, but their rent burden, which is the rent they're paying, remember, as a fraction of their total income, should actually be coming down. And so the long-term goal is not just to fix the bleeding right now, but is actually to try to give families room to breathe and room to save money, and hopefully kind of take a lot of stress and pressure off of all of the members of our community. A final point on this slide. You probably have heard or will hear, if you haven't heard it already, this claim people make about rent control. They say, well, you can't bring rent control to the city because it'll destroy all the rental housing. What do you mean? Well, they claim that if you control the rents, landlords won't be able to charge enough to fix apartments or to improve apartments. Now, this has always been a lie. Landlords, especially in the LA area, have really profited handsomely, especially recently. So there's really never been a problem with being able to afford repairs. However, just to make sure that this doesn't happen, and that this cannot happen with our amendment, we actually have built-in language which would allow landlords who can demonstrate to the city that they are not making enough money to afford necessary repairs, that they could file a petition, moderately increase the rent in excess of the cap we've set in place, and such that all of that moderate increase in rent, which would be temporary, would go to fund the repairs. So just if someone comes at you with this claim about rent control, just know that this has been foreseen, and there is a mechanism to make sure that rent control in no way decreases the quality of the rental housing stock in Pasadena. That's the last thing we would want to do. Okay, another thing that we're going to hear a lot of as we start to really ramp up this campaign and work on outreach and getting the word out, you're going to hear a lot about AB 1482, which is this law that was passed, came into effect in January. It was an assembly bill, so it's a state law that established eviction protections pretty similar, actually, to the protections that we just went over. But it established as well a weak form of rent control. And what I mean by weak is that it caps increases at 8% each year. So the first thing to notice is that it's an anti-gouging measure. It prevents landlords from doubling rent in a given month. So it does prevent this eviction loophole. But to understand exactly how onerous 8% each year is, there's a little number I'd like to keep in my head, which is that a number which increases by 8% every year will have almost doubled in 9 years. And so the question is, who among us has a wage that doubles every 9 years? And probably virtually nobody. So this bill, accomplishes some short-term protections against the worst of landlord behavior in terms of gouging, but it does not accomplish the real goal that, looking at this data at the beginning, that what we need to do is to bring down burden in the long term, so that people can thrive, and so that families are not priced out of their own homes, and Pasadena can actually really exist as a community. And this law just doesn't do that. And to top it all off, the bill actually, it expires in 2030. And I personally think this is because they understand the rent crisis as kind of a short-term emergency and not as a consequence of a long-term failure to bring stability to tenants. But in any case, just know that when people bring this up, there are very good reasons that we need stronger protections. And the little tagline we have is that the fight for housing justice has no expiration date, neither does our amendment. So practically speaking, we've drafted this amendment. We're very happy with it. We think that it brings a lot of protections to tenants. But what do we actually need to do to turn that proposed language into Pasadena law? And there is this process of a ballot initiative or a ballot measure, where anyone can file a petition. I think anyone who's eligible to vote can file a petition with Pasadena to bring a proposed change to Pasadena law onto the ballot, so that Pasadena voters can decide whether or not they want to change the law. And there are a couple ways in which to do this, but however you do it, you have to gather signatures. There's this petition process, and you have to get a number of people, Pasadena registered voters, to sign on and say, yes, we want this on the ballot. We want to be able to vote on this. And that is a significant the number of signatures you need is a significant fraction of the total number of registered voters. And Pasadena is not a small city, so this is a lot of people. There are easy ways and there are hard ways. So the percentage you need varies. The trouble with the easier ways, so the smaller number of signatures that would be easier for us to qualify our law for the ballot, is that we know city council is hostile. And in fact, many council members are landlords, and the mayor is involved in property development. So we know that whatever they can do to hamstring our protections, they're going to do. And if we go with any of these lesser, a lesser ballot measure, city council will be able to overrule the law. And so the only way to guarantee that they can't, to go over their heads, is to amend the city charter itself. And as well as I understand it, the city charter, it's this founding document for the city. I think of it kind of as like a constitution for the city. And if you amend it, if you succeed in passing a charter amendment, the only way to undo that law is to pass another charter amendment. So it's completely out of city council's hands. So this is absolutely what we plan to go with. The downside is that we need the signatures of 15% of registered Pasadena voters to even qualify our law to go on the ballot. And we're targeting the citywide elections in March 2022. allowing for invalid signatures, some people will think they're registered and they're not, so you have to account for that. The total number of signatures it'll be over 15,000. It could be 20,000. So it's a very, it's kind of a nauseating number, but there are lots of, so I'm going to pad it with optimistic statistics. So last attempt, this was attempted once before. I was not involved, but PTU was heavily involved. That produced over 10,000 signatures. So this isn't like, we should despair because there's no way we're going to get over 1,000. Definitely PTU has come within striking distance of this number in the past. The second thing to keep in mind is that there was a poll conducted on a survey on our behalf by POP, Pasadena's Organizing for Progress. And they basically surveyed randomized Pasadena residents and asked them, if these eviction protections and rent control laws, as described, were to show up on the ballot, would you vote for them? And over 80% said yes, they would vote for the eviction protection law. And right about 70% actually said yes, they would vote yes on rent control law. So there is really surprising support, and I think really encouraging support that tells us if we succeed in getting this thing on the ballot, we have a very good chance of winning and actually writing this stuff into our city charter. But at the same time, we need to keep in mind it's going to be a lot of hard work, and it's technically complicated. There are all these legal requirements for gathering the signatures correctly. So it's going to be an effort, and it's really going to require all of us working together. Which brings us to the state of the campaign right now. So there are roughly six steps to make amending the city charter. The first is to write the amendment. This is done. It's been done for a while, actually. It was finished last summer. There's legal review, which was done last fall. We had wonderful, wonderful attorneys with public counsel who worked pro bono, worked for free, to really vet like every sentence. And so we know from them that the law is in good shape and it's viable. It's not just going to get slapped down, as soon as we submit it. The next step is preparing this law into a petition format, which is what you actually circulate around the city and gather signatures on. Unfortunately, this is quite, it's finicky because there are all of these little requirements about exactly how it has to be prepared, that if you do them wrong, the city can just throw out your petition. So we're working with election lawyers currently, and we're trying to figure out exactly when we want to finish the stage up, format it, and submit it to the city. So, but that it's going to be soon that we do this. So the fourth step is submitting the language to the city. The attorney looks at it. They give us a title for the law. They give us a summary, which would appear on the ballot. And then as soon as they give that back to us, we have 6 months to, at the very beginning, to print the stuff out onto these petitions and gather those 20,000 signatures. And 6 months sounds like a long time, but it's a lot of signatures. So gathering efforts is going to be the real task that we need to figure out in the short term. The last stage is getting out the vote. Once we pass that threshold, we give the signatures to the city. We'll have until March 2022 to convince Pasadenans that this is absolutely critical and that they have to vote yes on rent control and just cause eviction protections. So the final slide, I'm probably over time already. I'll make this quick, but the stage we're at now, so far it's been a small group of people working on pretty technical legal stuff. But as soon as we submit this to the city, we need to be able to hit the ground running. Right? We don't want to waste any of those 6 months kind of figuring things out and organizing people. So the first thing, we need to start on getting this organization done ahead of time as soon as we can. And the biggest task is to organize gatherers. And so we need lots of people who are willing to circulate this petition to friends, to family, acquaintances, religious congregations, your church, your synagogue, your mosque, wherever there are like-minded people, who support this and might sign, get these petitions to them. They're also, and this is true in pretty much every other year, that you gather in public spaces. You set up a table in the parking lot outside of the grocery store and ask strangers, explain the law and ask for their support. This is kind of an open question in light of the situation with coronavirus. There is the possibility that if we delay the starting of gathering by a few months, California's numbers could come down and people might be kind of psychologically more ready to come up to your table, and talk to strangers and actually sign something you give them. So this is a discussion that we're having, and I think we should, if there's time, discuss here a little bit. But at the very least, it's going to require being a gatherer. It's going to require talking to everybody you know, a lot of passing this thing around and really getting as many names as you can. The second ask, which is also critical, is outreach. So word of mouth is going to be extremely important, and the more times, I think Ryan may have said this, that the more you can get people, the more frequently you can get people mentioning your campaign in any given day, the more it's on their minds, the more signatures you're going to get. And so we need people who are willing to do all sorts of outreach, people who are confident writers who could write op-eds for print media, people who could write arguments, or blast social media accounts all the time, so that this is kind of in front of people's eyes constantly. Anyone who has contacts within the media that might be able to facilitate us getting an op-ed out there, that's critical. People willing to act as public speakers and to give talks like this one to organizations that might help us out, that's going to be very important. People who are willing to be interviewed by journalists and explain the campaign, also important. The best part of talking to PTU is that there's so much skill and there's so much talent in organizing. And that's going to be really a central part of this effort, especially people who are willing to train gatherers and plan and direct gathering efforts. So we envision it's probably going to be a little bit like if you've ever done canvassing for a political campaign, trying to work out how do we distribute all of the labor so that we get the most signatures per hour, and which neighborhoods do we canvass and which don't we, et cetera. We'll need graphic designers for print, for flyers and posters, kind of attractive things that catch people's eyes. And also, if anyone knows anything about web design, that would be much appreciated. We have a website that I believe Peishi and Kate were working on. It's wonderful. They did an excellent job, but it does need to be updated and kind of kept current. And then the final thing is funding. Luckily, because we have so many people, we hope to be able to do a lot of this gathering through volunteers. But currently, the election lawyers we are employing to prepare this petition are expensive, and we need some help with defraying those legal costs. So, if anyone knows someone at a progressive organization that is willing to fund local rent control efforts, we would very much appreciate help in paying off those debts. So that I've gone way over as it is, I think. So I'm going to turn it over just to an open discussion and a Q&A. Yeah, I'm really excited to see this thing take off, and thank you so much for giving me the time.